The heat lay heavy over the Holloway estate as if the very air refused to move, thick and breathless beneath the swollen Georgia sky of 1836. Even before Eleanor Holloway crossed the threshold, she felt the oppressive stillness that clung to the land like something long dead but unwilling to settle. The orchards were the first to greet her, if they could be called that now. Once full and shimmering with life, they stretched in sickly rows, the branches skeletal, peeled of leaves as though something had fed on them from within. Blackened fruits sagged on stems, collapsing under their own soft rot. The soil, usually dry this time of year, pulsed with humidity, smelling faintly of bruised peaches and something metallic beneath. Eleanor halted at the fence, gloved fingers tightening on the wood. The Holloway orchards had been her childhood sanctuary. She had run through these rows laughing, skirts caught in branches, hair filled with the sweet scent of ripening fruit. But the trees now leaned inward, collapsing in on themselves, their shadows long and distorted in the dwindling light. A breeze stirred, but only at her back, as though the estate exhaled in her direction, urging her forward. She stepped inside. Mud clung thick and dark to her boots. The path had warped since she last walked it, buckling under the weight of years and neglect. As she approached the main house, a familiar creak rose from the porch, the boards bending slightly under no visible weight. Her heart stumbled. That sound, steady, rhythmic. Rock, rock, rock. For an unsettling moment, she thought it was the old porch swing. But the swing had been removed years ago after her mother's passing. The sound came from inside. The windows of the Holloway house reflected nothing of the world outside. Curtains hung motionless, the glass clouded from within, as though the house had not breathed in decades. Eleanor pushed the door open, and the air hit her with the stench of damp wood and rusted iron. The Holloway estate had always been warm. Now it feels feverish. She let her traveling bag fall to the floor, its thud swallowed instantly by the house's oppressive silence. And yet. Rock, rock, rock. It echoed faintly through the hallway, dragging across the warped floorboards above. The nursery. Eleanor swallowed, throat tightening with an instinctive dread she had no reason to feel. She had not been in that room since she was a child. She had no memories of fear there, only half-remembered lullabies and her mother's soft humming. But her father's letters had mentioned the nursery often in his last months, though never plainly. Always in fragments. The orchard room watches at night. The cradle still moves when no one touches it. Marjorie hums to quiet something I cannot name. Marjorie Vale. Even hearing her name unspoken in her mind chilled Eleanor more than the heat could warm. Marjorie had been the estate's enslaved nurse since before Eleanor's birth. A woman of quiet steps and unreadable eyes, who seemed to drift more than walk, as though her feet barely touched the ground. Rumors had followed her like insects clinging to a lantern. Whispers from servants. Superstitions from neighbors. Terrible tales from children who listened at doors. They said Marjorie was seen most often at night, her figure lingering in the nursery even when there were no children left to tend. They said she sang lullabies in a cracked, wavering voice at hours when no cradle should ever rock. They said she had stood motionless over the Holloway infants, one after another, long after their cries had faded. Eleanor pushed the memories away. The heat was making her imagine things. Rumors were just that. Her footsteps echoed as she climbed the staircase. Halfway up, she paused. The rocking had stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sound. The upstairs hallway stretched long and narrow, thick with shadows pooling in the corners. The nursery door at the end was slightly ajar, a thin line of darkness spilling out. Eleanor approached, pulse fluttering. The smell hit her first, stale linen, old milk, and the dampness of wood that had absorbed decades of sorrow. She pushed the door open. Inside, the nursery was smaller than she remembered. The wallpaper had peeled in long strips, curling like dried skin. The window was cracked, letting in a thin blade of dying sunlight that sliced across the floorboards. And in the center. The cradle. Empty. Rocking. Only once. Then still. Eleanor's breath caught. She stepped forward slowly, skirts brushing against the dusty floor. The cradle's carved legs were cracked, one splintered, as though something heavy had once pressed down upon it. A faint trace of movement flickered in the corner of her vision. But when she turned, nothing was there. She exhaled, trying to steady herself. The nursery had always made strange noises. Old houses creaked. Wind shifted things. Floors settled. There was nothing unnatural about it. Yet the air in the room felt wrong, thick and damp, as though it had not been breathed out for years. She traced her fingertips along the cradle's rim. The wood was warm, unnervingly so, as if someone had touched it only moments before. A floorboard behind her let out a sharp pop. She spun. A figure stood in the doorway. Marjorie. Her posture was straight, hands folded neatly before her apron. Her hair, streaked with premature gray, was tied tightly at the nape of her neck. Her eyes, dark, glassy, unreadable, did not blink. She had aged, yet somehow she seemed unchanged. As though time had chosen to pass around her rather than through her. Eleanor forced herself to breathe. Marjorie, she managed softly. The woman didn't speak. Her gaze flicked to the cradle, then returned to Eleanor. For a moment, neither moved. Then Marjorie stepped back, as silently as she had appeared, and vanished into the dim hallway. Eleanor's heartbeat thudded painfully in her ears. She wanted to call after her, to ask what had happened here while she had been away. To ask why the nursery felt like it was holding its breath. But her voice would not rise. She knelt beside the cradle, examining its legs. Something had carved faint marks into the wood. They were shallow, uneven. Not from a knife. More like scratches. Tiny ones. Her stomach twisted. The orchard wind pressed against the cracked nursery window, making the room's shadows shift like something alive. Eleanor stood abruptly. She needed to get out. She needed air that wasn't suffocating with memories and whispers and ghosts. As she stepped into the doorway, a sound drifted through the hall. A soft, wavering hum. A lullaby. Marjorie's voice. Coming from the far end of the house, though Eleanor had seen her walk the other way. The notes trembled as though sung by someone standing far beneath the floorboards. Eleanor forced herself down the stairs, gripping the banister until her knuckles paled. She nearly stumbled at the bottom. The house felt alive behind her. Breathing. Watching. Holding secrets in the dark. Her father's last letter echoed in her chest. Do not linger in the orchard room. Do not trust the quiet. And never, my Eleanor, never touch the cradle when it rocks on its own. The floor creaked behind her. Eleanor didn't turn. She simply stepped out of the house and into the evening heat, letting the door shut heavily behind her, the lullaby fading but not stopping. It would be hours before the sun finally collapsed behind the orchard line. Hours before the Holloway estate slept. Hours before Eleanor realized the cradle had never stopped moving. The morning crept over the Holloway estate with no warmth, only a dull grayness that pressed against the windows like a damp cloth. Eleanor Holloway stood on the back porch with a cup of weak tea in her hands, watching the dying orchards writhe gently beneath the fog. A thin drizzle coated the land, turning the soil into a dark, clinging sludge. Every breath she took tasted of metal. The same metallic heaviness lingered inside the house as well, as though the halls still echoed with last night's lullaby. The memory of it had not left her, not the wavering, sorrowful notes, nor the way the cradle's final, solitary rock seemed to pulse in the shadows. Eleanor tried to ground herself in routine. She laid out her mother's old journals, sorted the belongings scattered across the front parlor, and instructed the household workers to air out the rooms. But the moment Marjorie Vale entered the doorway, everyone fell silent. Marjorie moved with the same unnerving calm she always had, silent, deliberate steps, as though the floorboards parted for her rather than creaked beneath her weight. Her presence drew the air tighter, like fabric pulled taut. Eleanor attempted polite conversation, but the woman responded only with nods, her gaze focused somewhere just beyond Eleanor's shoulder, as if she were watching a memory drift by. It was the cook, Lydia Bramble, who spoke once Marjorie had left the room. "Miss Eleanor," Lydia whispered, leaning in as though someone might be listening from the walls, "you best keep your distance from her. That nurse ain't the sort you stand too close to." "Not anymore." Eleanor blinked. "Anymore?" Lydia hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron, her gaze darting toward the darkened hallway that led to the nursery. "There's stories," she said quietly. "Been stories for years. Folks don't like to speak of them, but they linger, same as her shadow." Eleanor tried to smile, though it faltered. "Stories can twist themselves into all manner of shapes. I prefer to know the truth." But Lydia only shook her head, eyes wide with something older than fear. "Truth don't live long in this house, Miss Eleanor. Not with all that's buried under them orchards." Eleanor set her teacup down, her spine stiffening. "What do you mean?" Before Lydia could answer, footsteps approached, heavy, hurried, and the stableman, Grant Hollis, burst into the parlor, hat twisting in his hands. "Beggin' your pardon, miss," he said, breathing hard. "You best come see what the storm dragged in last night." He led her through the dripping courtyard toward the orchard's edge. The mud sucked at their boots, gripping like something alive. The fog swirled low to the ground, thick enough to hide the smaller roots. When they reached the first row of trees, Grant pointed to a mound of disturbed soil. Eleanor crouched. It wasn't merely disturbed. Something had clawed its way upward. Roots twisted through loosened dirt, small and spindly, as though reaching for light that no longer belonged to them. Grant swallowed hard. "Never seen the roots rise after a storm. Looks like they're trying to escape the ground." Eleanor touched the nearest root. It felt warm beneath her fingertips. Too warm. She pulled her hand back. Grant leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Some say the orchard ain't sick. They say it's protectin' itself. Or warnin' us. 'Cause every time them roots rise, Miss Eleanor, the nurse starts her singin', and somethin' in the nursery stirs." Lydia had followed them silently. Now she crossed herself. "The legends go back further than your memory, child." Eleanor stood sharply. "Legends of what?" "Of Marjorie Vale," Lydia whispered. "Of the nurse who outlived every Holloway child she ever touched." Eleanor tensed. "That is an ugly accusation." Lydia's eyes filled with remorse. "I don't mean it cruel, Mississippi. But there's things your father never told you. Things no one would dare write down." The drizzle deepened into a steady, cold rain, dripping through the orchard branches like tears. Grant cleared his throat. "My uncle used to say she had a way of standin' in the nursery that chilled a man from crown to heel. Said she'd stare at them cradles long after the babies were gone. Stand there hummin' at nothin' but the empty air." Eleanor shook her head. "Grief affects people differently. She cared for those children." "Maybe so," Lydia whispered. "But it wasn't grief that folks saw. It was somethin' else. Somethin' old." Eleanor felt the orchard watching her, branches angled downward like skeletal arms. Rain pattered against the earth, releasing a sour scent of rot. "What else do people say?" she asked quietly. Lydia hesitated. "They say she marks the cradle legs before a child passes. Little symbols. Carvings. Not for harm, maybe for warning. Maybe for something worse." Grant shifted uneasily. "And they say she don't sleep. She walks the house at night, hummin' those broken lullabies. Even the walls feel it." The wind hissed through the bare branches. "But the strangest tale," Lydia murmured, "is that she ain't the one doin' the harm at all. They say she's keepin' somethin' in the orchard from gettin' inside. Eleanor stiffened. Something in the soil, Grant replied. Something that takes to the cradles first. A shudder rippled up Eleanor's spine. She picked up her skirts and turned away. These are stories, she said firmly. Stories meant to frighten children. But even as the words left her mouth, she could not shake the sensation she had felt the night before, the unmistakable pressure of something watching her through the nursery window. When she returned to the house, the air inside felt thicker, heavier. The floors seemed to groan beneath their own weight. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step echoing through the silence. At the top of the landing, she froze. The nursery door was open. She knew she had closed it. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She stepped toward it, her breath shallow. Inside, the cradle sat motionless, but the air around it trembled with a faint, unsteady chill. Something glimmered on the floor. She knelt. A small carving lay half buried in dust, a piece of wood shaped crudely like a cradle. Its legs were long and pointed, carved with uneven grooves. A symbol was etched into its base. Not a child's plaything. Not something left by accident. A warning. Behind her, the hallway creaked. Eleanor looked over her shoulder. Marjorie stood there again. Silent. Still. Her gaze fixed not on Eleanor, but on the carving. Her lips parted, just slightly, as though a word had formed and died before she could give it breath. Eleanor rose slowly, heart slamming against her ribs. Marjorie, she whispered. What is this? The nurse took one step backward. Then another. And vanished into the shadows without a sound. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Eleanor clutched the carving in her hand. A splinter pierced her palm, drawing a bead of blood that ran down her wrist. Something thudded outside the nursery window. A soft, rhythmic tapping. She forced herself to look. A tree branch scraped the glass. Except the nearest tree was nearly 20 feet away. Eleanor stumbled back, nearly dropping the carving. A whisper drifted through the room, barely audible. It starts in the cradles. She spun, but no one stood there. The whisper faded as the orchard wind moaned through the walls. Shaken, Eleanor hurried down the hall, moving faster than she intended. She reached the staircase and descended quickly, gripping the banister so hard her knuckles whitened. The parlor felt colder now. She sat heavily in her father's old armchair, the carved cradle clutched tightly in her fist. Lydia entered quietly, her face pale. Miss Eleanor, she said softly, if you're still looking for truth, you'll find it in the stories folks tried to bury. In the ones your father feared most. Eleanor stared at her, breath uneven. What do you mean? Lydia's hands trembled. The orchard room incidents didn't start with you. Didn't start with Marjorie either. The orchard's been dying for years, child. Just as the babies did. And the nurse, she's the only one who stayed, even when everyone else ran. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. Why would she stay? Lydia swallowed hard. Because she knows what's beneath this house. The rain outside intensified, beating against the windows like frantic fingers. And she knows, Lydia continued shakily, what's still trying to rise. Dawn broke with the color of spoiled milk, a pale, sickly light that sifted through the Holloway estate's warped shutters and settled into its corners like dust. Eleanor Holloway awoke with a start, her breath shallow, her nightdress clinging damp against her skin. She had dreamt of the orchard again, of branches bowing low as if in mourning, of roots twisting beneath her feet like hands clawing at the earth. And above all, she dreamt of the lullaby. That cracked, trembling voice humming from somewhere beneath the nursery floorboards. Her pulse refused to settle. She pushed herself upright and paced the length of her childhood room. The floor felt strangely warm beneath her bare feet, as though the wood had retained heat from a fire that had never burned. When she descended the stairs, the house greeted her with familiar scents, old timber, extinguished candles, and the faint metallic tang that clung to the Holloway air like rust. Lydia met her at the bottom of the staircase with a curtsy, but her expression was troubled. "Did you sleep at all, Miss Eleanor?" she asked. "Not well," Eleanor admitted. "The house, the sounds." Lydia's gaze flicked upward, toward the ceiling. "Ain't no shame in that. The Holloway nights carry old burdens." Eleanor's fingers tightened on the banister. "What burdens?" But Lydia only lowered her eyes and murmured, "Some burdens speak loudest in silence." Eleanor wanted answers, she needed them, but the cook's trembling hands offered none. She found solitude instead in her father's study. It had been untouched since his passing, shelves sagging under weathered books, the desk crowded with quills and half-filled ledgers. Dust lay thick upon every surface, disturbed only by the faint outline of where one journal had rested. The journal now lay open. Eleanor frowned. She had not touched it since the night she returned. She approached warily, as though expecting the shadows around it to shift. Her father's handwriting sprawled across the page in hurried strokes, ink blotched from a trembling hand. "The orchard speaks at night now. Roots against the foundation. Something waking beneath the boards." A chill slipped down Eleanor's spine. She turned the page. "Marjorie hears it too. I find her standing in the nursery long after the candles die. Watching the cradle. Whispering to something I cannot see." Eleanor stepped back from the desk, her stomach twisting. She remembered her father as a man of logic, not superstition. For him to write such things. Another page. "The marks have returned on the cradle legs. I carved them out last winter, but they grew back. As though the wood remembers. As though something beneath presses upward." Her breath hitched. She swallowed hard, forcing herself through the next entry. If Eleanor returns, she must not enter the orchard room. She must not speak to Marjorie alone at night. And she must never let the cradle move of its own accord. Eleanor closed the journal sharply. The silence in the room thickened. Outside, the orchard wind groaned low against the window, bending branches that should have been too far to touch the house. Later, unable to remain still, Eleanor ventured into the eastern wing of the estate, a part of the house long abandoned after her mother's death. The hallway smelled of mildew and old lace. Wallpaper curled downward in brittle sheets. The wooden floor bowed beneath her weight. At the end of the hall, a small linen closet stood slightly ajar. A faint humming drifted from within. Eleanor froze. The tune was unmistakable. Marjorie's lullaby. But the bedroom doors around her were all open, empty, and the stairwell behind her was silent. Her pulse hammered. She pushed the linen closet door open. Nothing. Only folded sheets. Towels. Blankets yellowed with age. Yet the humming persisted for another breath, another two, before tapering off into an unnatural quiet. "Miss Eleanor." She spun. Grant Hollis stood a few paces away, hat in hand, his face pale. "I didn't mean to frighten you." "You didn't," she lied. Grant hesitated, then stepped closer. "I been meaning to tell you, your father used to come down this hallway most nights in his last year." Eleanor frowned. "Why?" Grant shifted his weight uneasily. "Said he heard things. Not voices, just sounds. Light ones. Like breathin'. Like the orchard roots pressin' against the house." She wrapped her arms around herself. "He must have been unwell. Maybe." Grant's voice lowered. "Or maybe he knew what was comin'. She turned away, unwilling to hear more. But Grant spoke again, gentler this time. "You ain't alone in hearin' the lullaby, Miss Eleanor. Half the staff's heard it over the years. Sometimes from the nursery. Sometimes from the orchard itself." Her blood went cold. "From the orchard?" Grant swallowed. Your father ordered us never to go there after dark. The roots shift. The ground breathes. And sometimes, he hesitated. Sometimes something taps at the windows when the moon's low. Eleanor's heart pounded so hard she felt it in her throat. By late afternoon, the storm clouds had thickened again, pressing low against the horizon. Eleanor wandered outside, unable to remain trapped in the suffocating house. The orchard loomed before her, rows upon rows of withered branches, sagging fruit, and darkened soil. The air smelled of rot and something older. She stepped between the first two trees. The mud pulled at her boots, thick and reluctant. A hush fell over the orchard, deeper than silence. A soft thud echoed in the distance. Then another. Not fruit falling. Not branches shifting. Something rhythmic. Something measured. Like a cradle rocking. Eleanor's breath hitched. She almost turned back, but a faint glimmer caught her eye in the dirt beneath a half-dead peach tree. A small wooden carving. Another cradle. Much like the one she found beside the nursery. She knelt and brushed away the mud. This one bore deeper carvings. Symbols etched with careful precision. The legs were splintered at the ends, as though crushed under pressure. A shadow fell across her. She stiffened. Slowly, she rose and turned. Marjorie stood a few paces away. Her expression was unreadable. Her apron stained with orchard mud. Her eyes fixed on the carving in Eleanor's hand. Why are these buried in the orchard? Eleanor whispered. Marjorie did not answer. Her gaze lowered to the earth, then drifted upward toward the boughs that drooped like mourning limbs. Eleanor stepped forward. Marjorie. My father wrote about the cradle marks. About the nursery. About something beneath the floor. Marjorie's jaw tensed. The first words Eleanor had heard her speak in years slipped out in a whisper barely louder than the breeze. Not all things buried stay dead. Eleanor froze. What do you mean? Marjorie's eyes flicked toward the house, toward the nursery window. The Holloways carry a silence, she murmured. A long line of silence. Passed from mother to child. From blood to soil. You can hear it if you listen. Eleanor swallowed, throat tight. Hear what? Marjorie's gaze darkened. Their cries. A gust of wind swept through the orchard then, cold and punishing. It rattled the branches overhead, sending dead fruit thudding to the ground around them. Eleanor stepped back instinctively. Marjorie did not move. Her stillness was unsettling, as though she rooted herself into the very soil. Lightning flashed somewhere far beyond the estate. When Eleanor looked back, Marjorie was already turning away, swallowed slowly by the orchard shadows. Eleanor clutched the carving close to her chest. Her pulse throbbed painfully. The orchard wind moaned again, low and wounded, echoing through the dying branches. Not all things buried stay dead. The words reverberated inside her. She backed away step by unsteady step, her gaze locked on the trees. Only when she reached the porch did she feel the house behind her. The air pressed against her skin. The sky dimmed. A faint thudding resumed deep within the orchard. Rhythmic. Measured. Like something rocking. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself. The Holloway estate was speaking. And she feared she was beginning to understand its language. The fevered heat settled over Holloway Orchard like a woolen shroud, heavy and unmoving. By late afternoon, the air tasted of fermenting fruit and copper, and the gnats collected in slow, spiraling clouds that clung to the eyes. Eleanor Holloway stood on the warped-back terrace, staring across the rows of dying apple trees that bent like old men in prayer. The orchard had once been the pride of her grandfather's estate, rows of wide, sunlit branches that brushed against one another with a choir-like hush. But now the trees sagged under the weight of mildew and decay. Apples rotted where they hung, too soft to fall, branches snapped at their joints, the earth soured. Eleanor felt a tremor beneath her ribs, as though something old and restless stirred beneath the orchard soil. She had come to seek answers, or at least a quiet moment to gather her thoughts, but the orchard did not grant quiet. Every sound seemed magnified, the crackle of bark, the rustle of dead leaves clinging to brittle branches, the distant creak of a shutter tapping against the nursery window upstairs. The nursery. She had left its door closed behind her not an hour earlier, yet she felt as though the room were still breathing down her neck. And through that door she had heard the faintest whisper, as though something inside the walls had exhaled. Eleanor tightened her shawl and stepped down into the orchard path, her boots sinking into the mud with wet sighs. The trees formed a crooked corridor overhead, limbs intertwining like fingers trying to bar her passage. The deeper she walked, the more the air thickened, until it felt as though she moved through a slow, syrupy dream. Somewhere ahead came the faint sound of humming. A low, fractured lullaby. Eleanor froze. She knew the melody. Everyone in the house knew it. Children had repeated it for decades, sometimes without realizing it. The enslaved nurse, Marjorie Vale, had sung it while walking the orchard rows at night, always at night, her footsteps nearly silent, her shadow long and hunched. But Marjorie had not lived in this orchard for 20 years. Eleanor swallowed hard and continued forward. Her pulse thundered. The hum grew clearer, threading itself through the branches like a thin ribbon of breath. The tune wavered between notes, as though the singer no longer remembered how the melody should end. Then the humming stopped. Something shifted behind her. A branch cracked sharply. Eleanor spun. At first she saw only the orchard. But then, between two twisted trunks, she glimpsed a figure standing very still. Her breath caught. The figure wore no dress she recognized. A faded gray cloth hung from narrow shoulders, and beneath the loose fabric, the shape was thin, almost gaunt. The head was tilted slightly, as though in curiosity. "Who's there?" Eleanor whispered. The figure did not answer. It remained perfectly motionless. Then, without warning, it stepped backward into the shadow of the tree. Gone. No rustle, no footfall. Just absence. A wave of cold moved through Eleanor's gut, settling low, pulsing. She forced herself to step closer, searching the underbrush, the dark folds between branches, but nothing remained. Not a footprint. Not a broken leaf. Only the smell. A faint metallic scent, like the nursery's air. She pressed a hand against her throat and backed away. "This estate is poisoning itself," she murmured. Another voice answered, startling her. "Ma'am." It was Jonah Fletcher, the groundsman's son, emerging onto the path with a spool of rope slung over his arm. Jonah was 17 at most, wiry, sunburnt, earnest-eyed. He bowed awkwardly. "You shouldn't be wandering out here alone, Miss Eleanor," he said. "Strange things have been going on." "What kind of things?" Jonah licked his lips, uncomfortable. "Night sounds. Movin' shadows. Heard a baby cryin' out here 2 nights ago. There ain't no babies left on the estate, 'cept," he swallowed the rest. Eleanor finished the thought for him. "Except in the nursery." He looked away. "Jonah," she said softly, "do you know anything about Marjorie Vale?" He startled, nearly dropping the rope. "Folks don't talk about her, ma'am." "Then talk to me." Jonah shifted uneasily. "My pa said she was touched by something unholy. Said she could stop a baby's cry just by walking past its cradle." "That's a superstition." Jonah shook his head. "Pa ain't the only one who said it. Sometimes folks heard the cradle crack after she left the room. Babies got crushed under the legs, ma'am. But they said she never laid a hand on 'em. Just stood there. Starin'. Like she was listening to something nobody else could hear." A shiver crawled across Eleanor's arms. And after the deaths, she whispered. Jonah hesitated. People said she kept rockin' the empty cradles in the orchard room. Even after the tracks in the wood showed they'd been crushed. Rockin' them with nothin' inside but shadows. The orchard seemed to lean closer around them. Eleanor exhaled shakily. Jonah, have you ever heard her singing? He blinked in confusion. And no, ma'am. She's been dead a long while. Eleanor opened her mouth, but a sudden, sharp sound cut through the orchard. A single cradle creak. Not from the house. From somewhere among the trees. Jonah's face went white. Ma'am, we oughta go. Eleanor nodded slowly, backing away, but her gaze remained fixed on the rows of trees. The cradle sound repeated, rhythmic, steady, wrong. She clutched Jonah's arm, and together they hurried back toward the estate, mud clinging to their boots. But before they stepped onto the terrace, Eleanor glanced behind her. A shape stood among the trees once more. The same gray cloth. The same tilted head. Marjorie Vale. Eleanor sucked in a breath. The figure slowly lifted an arm, and with one long, deliberate finger, pointed toward the nursery window. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Jonah, she whispered. It's not the orchard that's wrong. It's the house. He followed her gaze, and gasped. A curtain in the nursery fluttered. No wind. No hand. Just a slow, unnatural ripple, as though something pressed against the fabric from inside. Eleanor felt the orchard's breath at her back, hot as wrought. In the shadow of the trees, Marjorie Vale's shape dissolved into the darkness, leaving behind only the faint echo of a cracked lullaby. And Eleanor realized, with a cold certainty, that the Holloway estate had never let Marjorie leave. It had kept her. Bound her. Fed on her. And now it waited, for the next Holloway to listen. Night came to Holloway estate without stars, as though the sky itself refused to look upon the house. A bruised darkness pressed against the windows, thick and impenetrable. Eleanor Holloway stood at the foot of the grand staircase, candle trembling in her hand, while the rest of the house seemed to lean inward to listen. Something had been moving beneath the floor. Not rats. Not settling wood. Something heavier. Slow. Purposeful. Like the dragging of cloth over splintered boards. Miss Eleanor? Jonah's voice rose faintly from the back corridor. You hear that? I do, she whispered. The sound came again, thud, drag, thud, as though someone crawled just beneath her feet. Eleanor's breath fogged in the warm air. She stepped forward. A sharp crack echoed from the nursery above. The cradle. She didn't need to see it to know it had moved. Jonah hurried to her side, pale and rigid. We shouldn't go up there, ma'am. We must, she said. She did not tell him that the figure in the orchard had pointed toward that room. She did not tell him she feared her family had buried something inside those walls long before she was born. Together they climbed the staircase, the candle flame bending backward as if resisting the ascent. On the landing, the air thickened, metallic and wet. The nursery door stood slightly ajar. Eleanor's pulse pounded. She pushed the door open. Inside, the cradle rocked. No wind. No hand. Just a long, scraping arc across the warped wood, forward, back, forward, so slowly it seemed to fight the room itself. Jonah whispered, Lord save us. But Eleanor stepped inside. The walls were damp again, though the house had seen no rain in weeks. The boards beneath her feet bowed as though softened from within. And beneath the cradle, the floor dipped, just slightly, forming a shallow, unnatural depression. Something had pushed upward. She lowered herself, candle flickering, and pressed a hand to the floor. Warm. As if something breathed beneath. Jonah hovered at the doorway. Don't touch it, ma'am. Too late. A pulse traveled beneath her palm. She jerked back. Horrified silence filled the room. Then a whisper, a cracked lullaby, drifted from the seam between the wallboards. The same melody Marjorie Vale had hummed in the orchard. The same song Eleanor's mother had avoided speaking of. The candle guttered. "Jonah," she said, swallowing hard, "help me move the cradle." He stared at her as though she'd asked him to lift a coffin with his bare hands. But after a trembling moment, he stepped forward. Together they gripped the carved frame. The wood felt damp, spongy, almost pulsing. They dragged the cradle aside. And the floor beneath it sagged visibly, forming a dark oval in the boards. Jonah's voice cracked. "Ma'am, it ain't safe." Eleanor pressed the tip of her boot against the soft spot. The plank shifted, then groaned, then snapped. A rush of hot, sour air burst upward. Jonah gagged. Eleanor forced herself to look. Below the floor lay a cavity, a shallow pit that extended beneath the entire nursery. She raised the candle, lowering herself to her knees. And there, half buried in the dirt, lay a bundle of grey cloth. At first she thought it was a discarded rag. Then she saw the shape. Thin shoulders. A bowed head. A sunken ribcage. Jonah choked out a prayer. Eleanor whispered, "It's her. Marjorie Vale." Her body lay curled beneath the floorboards like a forgotten relic, the cloth of her old dress nearly fused to the earth. Her arms were folded around a small, broken cradle leg. Not a child. A cradle leg. Eleanor's vision swam. The stories had been wrong. The babies had not been crushed by accidents. Not by superstition. Not by Marjorie's imagined wrath. They had been crushed by someone who had then forced Marjorie to hold the blame. Someone in the Holloway line. Eleanor's stomach twisted. The nursery walls pulsed, wet with condensation. A voice, Eleanor's mother's voice, rose in her memory, trembling, "We do not speak of the orchard room. We do not speak of Marjorie Vale. Some sins rot the bones if pulled to light." Eleanor stared at the pit. "Jonah," she whispered, "we have to remove her." Jonah shook his head. "Ma'am, you don't move the dead who ain't restin', dot." But Eleanor reached forward. Her fingers brushed Marjorie's sleeve. The body shifted, too lightly. As though empty. A hollow shell. Then the humming rose again, impossibly close, curling around Eleanor's ears like cold breath. Jonah grabbed her shoulder. "Ma'am, she ain't down there alone." A shadow moved beneath the body. Something crawled. Eleanor jerked back, scrambling away. The candle spit and nearly died. From beneath Marjorie's corpse, a thin arm extended, small, childlike, its tiny hand clutching another cradle leg. Eleanor's scream caught in her throat. The arm withdrew slowly, vanishing into the dark. Then came the sound. Creak. 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 Not from the cradle. From beneath the floor. As though unseen hands rocked something in the dark earth. Jonah seized Eleanor's arm. "We're leavin', now." But before they fled the nursery, a whisper rose beneath them, soft, aching, layered with sorrow. Marjorie Vale's voice. "Not my hands, not my sin." Then. Thud. Drag. Thud. The crawling thing beneath the floor began to move toward them. Eleanor grabbed Jonah and bolted. They stumbled down the staircase, candle barely holding, the floorboards above vibrating with something too small to be a person yet too deliberate to be anything else. Once in the parlor, Eleanor collapsed against the wall, gasping. Jonah paced, fingers tangled in his hair. "Miss Eleanor, there's something buried in this house. Something angry." Eleanor wiped tears from her cheeks, but her voice sharpened with resolve. "Not angry," she whispered. "Wronged." She stared toward the dark hall that led back to the nursery. "We have unearthed the truth, Jonah. My family did not merely hide their sins, they caged them. The nursery floor groaned overhead. The house itself seemed to breathe. And beneath that breath, faint and fractured, came the lullaby again. The song of the enslaved nurse who had watched every Holloway child. The woman was crushed not by sin, but by silence. And Eleanor realized the Holloway orchard purge had only begun its slow return. The night boiled above Holloway estate, swollen with smoke and a dull red glow that flickered across the horizon. The orchard burned again, another row of trees collapsing beneath the weight of their own rot. Sparks flew like fireflies made of ash, swirling in a fevered dance that refused to die. Eleanor Holloway stood at her bedroom window, staring at the blaze licking the far fields. She could feel its heat from here, even through the closed shutters. The Holloway orchard purge had been her grandfather's legacy, controlled burnings to stop the orchard's sickness. But tonight, the flames moved as though guided by something older than men. As though the orchard itself sought to tear free of the earth. Eleanor stepped back from the window. In the hallway beyond her door, the house groaned. Not from age. Not from settling. It groaned like a creature too long starved. Jonah burst into the room, breathless and smeared with soot. "Miss Eleanor, the fire's spreading faster than we can cut it. Like the flames are huntin' the roots. Pa says it ain't natural." Of course it wasn't. Because beneath those roots, beneath the nursery floorboards, beneath the bones of Marjorie Vale's abandoned body, something had awakened. A lullaby drifted through the corridor. Slow. Humming. Cracked. Jonah stiffened. "It's comin' from the nursery again." Eleanor lifted the oil lamp. "We finish this tonight. No more running." They moved through the corridor, shadows stretching long on the walls. As they neared the nursery, the air turned humid and metallic. Water beaded along the plaster. The boards underfoot trembled with distant movement. The nursery door had closed itself. Eleanor pushed it open. The room was dark save for the faint light of the burning orchard filtering through the window, casting trembling red bars across the floor. The cradle sat in the center of the room again, though they had shoved it against the wall hours before. It rocked. Forward. Back. Forward. Back. Eleanor stepped inside. "Marjorie," she whispered, "I know you can hear me." The rocking ceased. A shape materialized in the corner. Not solid. Not fully formed. A faint outline of a woman in a gray dress, edges blurring like mist at dawn. Her head tilted. Her hands hung limp at her sides. Jonah stumbled back. "Sweet Lord." "Stay," Eleanor said sharply. The figure twitched at the sound. Its chin lifted just enough to reveal the hollow impression of where Marjorie's eyes had once been. "Why the cradles?" Eleanor whispered. "Why were they broken?" The apparition shuddered. Then. From beneath the floor came a thud. Then another. Tiny. Soft. Rhythmic. Jonah's fingers dug into the doorway. "It's the thing we saw under her body. The little arm. It's moving again." "No," Eleanor whispered. "Not a thing." She knelt beside the cradle and placed her palm against the warped boards. A pulse traveled through her hand. Another. Another. Like a heartbeat. The floorboards bulged. Cracks split across them, dust rising in thin streams. The room filled with the sound of scraping, fingernails dragging along the underside of the boards. Marjorie's ghost recoiled, arms lifting as though to shield her ears. Her mouth opened in a silent scream. Then Eleanor understood. Marjorie wasn't crushing the babies, Eleanor breathed. She was trying to keep something from climbing up. Something that they wanted. As though in answer, the boards buckled, then split. A small form crawled through the crack. A child-shaped shadow, limbs sharp as sticks, face blank as soot. It held a broken cradle leg in its hand, clutching it like a rattle. Jonah gagged. "What is that?" Another shadow climbed out. Then another. Little hands gripped the ruptured boards. Little heads turned in unnatural angles. A chorus of tiny creaks filled the room. Eleanor choked on her heartbeat. "They're Holloways," she whispered. "The ones who died. The ones our family buried under the boards to hide the truth." Jonah stared in horror. "They're ghosts." "No," Eleanor stepped back. "They're remains. Twisted by something older than this house." The shadows advanced, slow, mechanical, like tiny marionettes dragged by invisible strings. Marjorie's ghost hovered behind them, shaking violently, as if trying to hold them back. But they slid through her as though she were only fog. One reached Eleanor's boot, pressing its small hand against the leather. The cradle behind her began rocking violently now, slamming forward, crashing back. Eleanor grabbed Jonah's arm and pulled him toward the door, but the shadows surged, swarming the threshold, blocking their escape. And then the floor trembled. From deep beneath the house came a roar, not loud, but vast. A hollow, ancient groan that reverberated through the walls. Outside, the burning orchard trees writhed and collapsed. A great cracking sound traveled through the house. Roots. Tearing upward. Ripping through the foundation. One root exploded through the parlor floor below, splintering the wood like bone. Jonah screamed, "The orchard, it's comin' inside." Another root burst through the nursery wall, coiling like a serpent, slick with sap dark as dried blood. The child shadows clung to it, crawling onto the twisting limb as if returning to their birthplace. Marjorie's ghost floated toward Eleanor, arms outstretched, not menacing, but pleading. Her voice, fractured and faint, drifted through the room. "Not my hands, not my sin, but yours to end." Eleanor felt something tear inside her chest. Her family had done this. Buried the truth. Blamed the only innocent woman in the house. And now the orchard sought its due. A root lashed across the nursery, knocking the cradle onto its side. It skidded across the floor and slammed into the doorframe, wedging it shut. Smoke curled through the cracks. The fire was spreading through the walls. Jonah threw his weight against the cradle. "Miss Eleanor, help me." She pushed with him, but the cradle refused to move, as though some invisible force held it fast. The child shadows crawled closer. Marjorie's ghost knelt beside the cradle, her form flickering, hand reaching toward the cradle leg clutched by the nearest shadow child. Eleanor realized what she needed to do. Without hesitation, she reached into the swarm of shadowed limbs. Her fingers closed around the child's tiny hand, cold, brittle as old paper, and she pried the cradle leg from its grasp. The child let out a soundless wail. Marjorie's ghost rose. Slowly. Powerfully. For the first time, her form solidified, her face clear, her gaze burning with a long-suppressed truth. She touched the cradle leg. The nursery went silent. The shadows froze. The roots recoiled. The entire house inhaled. Then Marjorie's voice rang out, strong and resonant. "This sin ends with me." The cradle leg splintered in her hand, shattering into dust. The shadow children dissolved. The roots writhed and shriveled, retreating into the earth with a hiss like dying breath. The fire outside roared higher, consuming the last of the orchard. Marjorie's form began to fade. Eleanor reached for her. "Wait, please." Marjorie's eyes softened. "Set them free," she whispered. Then she dissolved into ash. The room stilled. The air cleared. Jonah shoved the cradle aside, freeing the door. Together he and Eleanor stumbled into the smoke-filled hallway as the house shook behind them. Outside, the orchard burned in full fury, rows of flames rising like torches against the night. The land convulsed, collapsing inward as though a great pit opened beneath it. Eleanor and Jonah fled to the far field. They turned just as the nursery window shattered, flames bursting outward. The Holloway house groaned one final time. Then it collapsed into itself. Eleanor sank to her knees. Jonah steadied her, eyes wide with terror and awe. Across the collapsing roofline, through drifting sparks, Eleanor saw one last image. A cradle sitting perfectly upright in the front doorway. Rocking. Slowly. Smoothly. Without wind. Without hands. A final lullaby drifted from the ruins, no longer cracked, but peaceful. Marjorie's voice. And with it, a whisper that brushed Eleanor's ear. Let the dead sleep. Before you leave this tale behind, listen closely, subscribe, so these old shadows never forget your name.